Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to welcome you to this lunchtime briefing on Trump and Latin America, the end of multilateralism. If we are thinking about the relationship between South America, Central America, international Geneva, and of course the position that this region has in the world, one might say that in international global politics, for many years, this part of the world seemed to be relatively forgotten. Stable governance, a little bit on the periphery. But I think since there has been a change of government in the United States of America and Donald Trump has become president, the geopolitical importance of that region has skyrocketed to public attention. Not only did we see the fight for strategic dominance of the United States in the region again, in terms of hemispheric dominance. We also saw the decapitation of one country, Venezuela, where in January the president was captured and taken out of the country through a Hollywood-stylian initiative. So this is all very, very important, and I think it is so important that that we want to dedicate this briefing to understand the role of Central and South America, Latin America, much better, and what it means in the context of the discussion of the crisis on multilateralism. Welcome to all of you in the room here, but also welcome to all of you who are following this event online. Bienvenido, muchísimas gracias que hacen tiempo hoy. Somos ya un grupo de latinos que están muy interesados que pasa en la región, si somos de ahí o que si somos adoptados como yo, ¿no? Entonces, mi portugués no está muy bien, entonces lo dejamos para más tarde. Pero tenemos una comunidad de latinos muy fuerte en el instituto y de verdad tenemos que dar más énfasis a este continente en los estudios que hacemos aquí. Well, what we would like to do here then is to unravel the topic of Trump and Latin America along various dimensions. We want to speak about what it means in the current discussion on the crisis of multilateralism, from the perspective of international law, from the perspective of reconfiguring democracy, and also with respect to neo-imperial economic dynamics. And of course, what is the wonderful thing at the Graduate Institute, we can rely on a pristine set of colleagues who know a great deal about all these things. So let me just do a brief introduction. I'm very pleased that Lucile Maertens is joining us here today, Associate Professor in the International Relations and Political Science Department and also co-director of the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute. We have also Professor Nico Krisch, who is a professor and the head of the International Law Department. Then we have Professor Graziella Moraes Silva, professor of anthropology and sociology and co-director of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, and Professor Felipe Calvao, associate professor of anthropology and sociology. Thank you very much for making time, and let's go straight into the subject matter. Lucile, crisis of multilateralism, Latin America, what would you like to share with us?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, Harim. I'm really happy to be here today to discuss this topic. As you said, it's of the utmost importance. And maybe I would like to start by questioning what does the US foreign policy is doing to multilateralism in general, meaning how the reconfiguration of power dynamics actually create or even sustain a form of crisis of multilateralism, and then what are the implications also for Latin America. So maybe very briefly, what do we mean by multilateralism and what is being under attack? You can think of multilateralism in a very, I would say, simple way as a mode of interaction, meaning that it's more than two people, more than two actors that are cooperating. But it's also a political project that emerged in the second half of the 19th century, that was really deepened after the Second World War, and that is based on shared principle, mutual benefits, and really the idea that you need to collectively gather to overcome global problems. And so what is happening today? What is challenged today? The mode of interaction, more than two, is challenged by unilateralism and by also the bringing back bilateralism as the one-on-one, I would say, relation. But the political project is maybe, and that's what we're going to be discussing a bit more today, is really challenged today by a form of disrespect of the rules-based order, a discredit, a delegitimization, and disengagement from international organization and institutional responsibilities, included in terms of financial resources. And there is a general decline of trust and of global cooperation. This is not the first time that multilateralism is in crisis. And we can think of how UN institutions, think of the UN Security Council was blocked during the Cold War. We can also think about the very important financial crisis that the UN endured during the 1980s, especially under the Reagan administration. There's also all sorts of disappointment around internationalization and the UN, especially after the re-enchantment at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 1990s. So overall, I would not say that it's completely new that there is a crisis of multilateralism. And we can even, here at the Graduate Institute in April 2020, one of the issue of global challenges was actually dedicated to global governance in peril, and the introduction was entitled Multilateralism in Crisis, or Is It? And so just to show that it's not a conversation that is new. So what I want to do now is to try to problematize or try to summarize the main ways what the US is doing today kind of exacerbate something that was already there, but also change a few things, because I think while we need to historicize and remember that it's not the first crisis, we also need to recognize that there is a uniqueness in what we're living now in this moment. So for me, there's three main ways that we can summarize what the US is doing to multilateralism. It's contesting it, blocking it, and replacing it. So in terms of contestation, the first contestation is around the rationale behind multilateralism. And here again, it's not something new, because it's been criticized in the past. It's been criticized also for its disconnection between IOs and the people, or because of its Western base, historically like centered around the Western Hemisphere. So what's the difference here? It's that I would say the criticism is more profound, and there is a very systematic contestation of the ideas and values that are behind multilateralism. It's about questioning the principles, the norms, the practices of multilateralism by using nationalistic rhetoric, even erasing the very idea that peaceful cooperation is important and is beneficial to all. So that's the first way of contesting. The second way of contesting is contesting the multilateral agenda. And here again, internationalization has been accused of being politicized, as multilateralism as not being the solution to global problems. But what's different here is that it's actually the very existence of global problems that are denied. Like when you have a denial of climate change as being a global problem, or when even the COVID-19 pandemic was downgraded as just a little flu, this is kind of something different. It's about really challenging what should be on the multilateral agenda as if it just was not existing. And the final contestation is really about the outputs of multilateralism. Again, efficiency of internationalization of the UN has been on the table of criticism for years. But here, the criticism is much bigger, to the point of having the President Trump claiming that he can solve conflicts that the UN cannot do. But at the same time, we know that they are responsible for this. And because the second point of how they challenge multilateralism is by being an obstructor, by really blocking. And the blockage of internationalization at the moment is based on inconsistency, selectivity, and unpredictability. It's really around the decision-making places. So, for example, using the UN Security Council when it matters to them, to use a resolution to legitimize their own, the Peace Gaza plan, for example, but at the same time blocking the Security Council by using the veto power when they don't want to be part of it, or even creating an alternative, like a rival institution.
This is a fantastic helicopter analysis, what also we, of course, feel, and those of you who work in international organizations, you might identify with a lot of these approaches. Now, what does it mean for South America, for Central and South America, with respect to how this challenge at the global level filters down into the region?
So, all of this, what the US is doing by, as I said, blocking, also by cutting funds, by also refusing to apply the multilateral rules, by replacing them, redefining them, this kind of lead to a crisis of a very specific ways of understanding multilateralism, which is the US-sponsored multilateral architecture. So it's really the organizations that are highly dependent on the US, especially material support, that are under attack. Formal institutions, more political IOs than technical ones, and it's a crisis of predictability. Basically, the multilateral ruling was here to give predictability to international relations, and this is what is in crisis today. So what are the implications now? We can look at a different level. At the micro level, at the level of individuals, what does it mean? Like people working for a multilateral organization, it's unemployment, it's disappointment, it's precarity, loss of meaning in their work. For the people benefiting from their program, it's a loss of access to essential services, but also for the people directly or indirectly affected by the unilateral measures, it's like at the daily basis, like they can feel also this. I'm thinking of the embargo on Cuba. It's really something that is directly affecting the life of the people. If you look at the mezzo level, so what does it mean for institutions? There's a necessary adaptation that comes with, changing the mandate or like refocusing on something maybe that is more at the core of this of the organization. There's emerging forms of multilateralism, and I think this is kind of where we can also find hope, is that there is an opening for other actors through these challenges. So opportunity for domestic actors to play a bigger role, opportunity for private actors, and here I just want to raise that there is also a risk in terms of regulation and accountability that we need to take into account, but there is still something that to be said on this, and opportunity also for civil society. Even though there is this transactional approach and club diplomacy that we see. And maybe the final point is at the macro level, what does it mean for international relations, and especially for like country like in Latin America, there's a reformatting of international relations in the sense that bilateralism and nationalism are at the forefront at the expense of common goods. But it also means that regionalism and regional organization can take a bigger part, that you can also understand multilateralism à la carte, like we can see with the Chinese involvement in multilateralism. And it also means that middle powers they are less protected by the rules, like we've seen in the case of Venezuela, but also with the trade, the tariff, and so on. So what do they do in this context is that they really need to reaffirm the value of multilateralism. They need to anticipate so that they do not let Trump being the first mover that systematically dictates the agenda. And this needs political courage and coalition building strategy. But it also means that there is an opportunity for middle powers to matter more.
Thank you so much. Now let us move to international law. Nico, if I look at the last couple of months, and we see a bombing of ships at sea, we see decapitations by huge military efforts, just taking a president out of the country. And of course, we see the continued sanctions politics. I mean, in your international law department, all red lights must go on. What does an international lawyer make of all these politics in South America that are quite disruptive?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, indeed, kind of lots of red lights, but I mean, international lawyers are used to lots of red lights flashing all over the place. It's not that violations haven't been there in the past, but clearly there's a whole range of really kind of momentous violations going on that are, in a sense, kind of very blatant, right? And you can see the intervention in Venezuela that, in a sense, triggered us getting together in the first place. It's clearly, by all means, and sort of for pretty much all international lawyers that you ask, right, a completely clear violation of international law, of the UN Charter, of the general prohibition on the use of force. And one of the remarkable things about it is that the US didn't even try to justify it. Also the bombing of the boats in the Caribbean hardly went with an international legal justification. There's a vague gesturing at threats that emerge, and in the case of Venezuela, that this is a law enforcement operation. But there's not even an effort to really kind of frame that in the clothes of international law, as the US has done actually sort of pretty consistently in the past, even if it has broken international law with certain interventions. So that's quite new, and of course for international lawyers maybe that's even more disquieting. If you hear Donald Trump talk about international law, for example in this New York Times interview in January, where initially he's asked, well, sort of, what about international law? And he says, oh, well, I don't need international law. I don't look to hurt people. Showed about his understanding of what international law really is about. And then pushed further, right, he goes on to say, well, yeah, of course, we should respect international law, but then it all depends on how you define it. That was clear, so that was up for the US to define it. And we also have to keep the US safe, and so that's really the limit to what we do with international law, right? That shows you there's really clearly no place or no relevance for international law in this in the core of the US administration's policies. Now, I can say, well, that's certainly new, but of course, I think if you ask people in Latin America, they will say, well, okay, maybe it's all not so new, because of course we've known the US doing this for a few centuries, really, sort of throughout the Cold War. Of course, there was a variety of interventions. The abduction of Noriega from Panama was probably the clearest analog to the Venezuelan situation. But of course, there have been lots of overt and covert operations in Nicaragua with the Contras, in Chile with the coup of Pinochet, and you can have a long list. So, and of course, you can go back way further into the 19th century with a whole range of interventions following the Monroe Doctrine and all that. So, so clearly, in a sense, you can say, well, that seems new to us now, and maybe it seems new to us after the 1990s, where we had started to have hope that there could be something like a rules-based order. But people in many parts of the world, not only in Latin America, but especially maybe in Latin America, will tell you, well, it's always been like this, right? Sort of the great powers have intervened when they liked it, militarily or economically, and they have coerced us to do things. It's not that we are really that we've been in the driving seats, or that the rules have been really kept. And so I think it's, to an extent, if we want to ask ourselves, well, what is new? And there's probably a different scale here, a different degree of importance. There's also maybe a different kind of perception. I sense this in Europe. There's maybe for the first time in quite a while, really, that Europeans feel they're bossed around in a similar way as Latin Americans and Asians and Africans have for a long time. And so that sense of an erosion of the rules-based order is stronger, right? It wasn't so strong as long as Europe was quite at the center, and while the US and its European allies were doing things all over the world, well, we were not really affected. Now when it's about Greenland and other places, we've sensed, oh, well, something is going on that is really uncomfortable. And no, you cannot use economic coercion in order to tariffs and the like to get us to do things. Well, that's what we have been doing and what the US has been doing all along. So I think we have to somehow keep things a bit in perspective, and there's certainly a shift that goes along with a greater multipolarity, with a broader realignment of sort of global politics. But not all of what we're seeing there is altogether new.
It's fascinating. I mean, I think you put your finger on something very important. Latin American governments and people know the United States of America. And at least in Mexico, we say, tan lejos de Dios, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. No? So I see some Mexicans nodding here. Yeah, which means, of course, so far away from God, but so close to the United States. Huh? So that's now. But tell me a little bit more. Because we've seen a flurry of diplomacy by Latin American governments that have showed some some results, in fact. They diffuse tension. The Mexican president has been very effective in the policy. Petro and the President Petro and Trump I wouldn't call it a bromance, but at least they had a very pragmatic conversation. What would you tell to Latin American governments of the utility of international law in their diplomacy in order to mitigate the impact of what the United States wants to do?
Yeah, so that's of course a complicated story.
Briefly.
Very briefly, yeah. I think it's complicated. Many are tempted to, in a sense, sort of disregard international law to some extent, to sort of strike some deals like Trump wants and get out of harm's way to some extent. I think as a short-term strategy, many countries have tried this also kind of throughout the last year when kind of the whole trade war and kind of Liberation Day came along, sort of trying to cozy up to Trump and try to get a decent treatment so that the warships don't come around to your corner, right? So that's that, I think. But I think as Mark Carney kind of rightly said in a speech in Davos, right? I think rightly celebrated speech in Davos, that's maybe the wrong strategy, really. It might work in the short term, but it might only work maybe for the next few months. And then next time, kind of Trump will come around and say, well, no, I want something else, actually. You've given me that, but now I also want that. So kind of that might be really self-defeating unless Latin American countries and others in the world are able to somehow get their act together, unite around the defense of the common rules. There's a risk of a further erosion step by step. And then, once the US has done it, it's likely that not only the US will do it, but others as well. So if there is something of importance, and I think for most countries in the world, there is a great deal of importance in having rules that all abide by, more or less at least, they need to unite in the defense of those rules, and that includes the Europeans, I think, kind of who've been, especially when things happen to Venezuela and in other places, have been remarkably silent about those things. So clearly, I think kind of that longer-term orientation, I think, should drive governments, especially in Latin America, to really unite. And quite a few have been very outspoken, obviously, about the violation of international law in Venezuela, but also in other contexts.
And of course, it connects to a history of many Latin American governments of being a very strong supporter of the Charter and the UN system, together with other countries, with middle powers or smaller countries even. So there is something to hear the Latin voice in this hybrid alliances in support of the Charter and the multilateral system, of course.
Yeah, it's important actually kind of to notice in this context that it's Latin American countries that are particularly in front of the International Court of Justice, right? Yeah. They are using international law, international institutions, multilateral institutions for the disputes, and it's been them already in the early 20th century who have been trying to replace a power politics-based interaction in the Americas with a much more rules-based interaction that then led them in the Pact of Bogota to accept that they submit themselves to the jurisdiction of the ICJ, which most countries in other parts of the world haven't. So there's a very particular story to that, but it's often a particular story in view of the US nearby.
Thank you. Let's shift to the topics of governance, and particularly in the narrative around hemispheric dominance, the questions of democracy and authoritarianism have been very much at the forefront of the political discussions and of the very tough domestic fights over domestic politics, not just in Brazil, but also in many other countries. And we've seen, of course, and we are reminded that Latin America has been a wonderful and exciting laboratory of governance. I mean, if we see the diversity from Bukele in El Salvador to Arevalo de León in Guatemala to Argentina to Brazil and so forth, Mexico, this is a dream for academics to study. You direct the Hirschman Center for Democracy here. Governance and democracy is what you study. What do you see from this perspective currently happening in Latin America?
So thank you, Ahim. Good afternoon, everyone. Bom dia para os que estão no Brasil. Buenos dias para os que estão em Latinoamérica. It's a pleasure to be here, even if not to talk about the happiest of the topics, which is what the crisis of multilateralism and the new Trump administration means for democracy in Latin America, particularly in the aftermath of the Venezuelan invasion. I was asked to speak briefly, not an easy task, but I decided to focus and try to focus on three aspects. One, what is new in the way about this, and I think that the main novelty is actually that democracy is not on the forefront of the debate, at least not in Trump's and America's intervention narratives. Then I want to briefly discuss why it's not on the forefront anymore. Is it something deliberate? And finally, what are the consequences of this? So I think that many commentators have noted that right after the invasion of Venezuela, when Trump gave his discourse, democracy was not mentioned. And a lot of people were surprised, and partially because democracy has been sort of the justification for a lot of American, or let's say US interferences. After Bad Bunny's concert, I think we should be very careful about saying America, the US interference in Latin America. So for most of the 20th century, dating back from the entrance of the US in 1917, on the First World War, Woodrow Wilson actually claimed that the goal of the main objective of U.S. international policy was making the world safe for democracy. Of course, we can argue how much that is the real goal, but the matter of fact is that especially after 9/11, the idea of democracy building as being the main goal of American policy was on the mouth of everyone. In Latin America, it was not different. I mean, it dates back from the interwar periods, we could say even before, but especially in what was called the Banana Wars in Central America, in Mexico, and Caribbean. That was very much the gist of the debate. Then, of course, during the Cold War period, it was very much the idea that democracy was the same as capitalism, and communism, therefore, was the opposite of democracy. So the anti-communist sort of idea as for democracy actually, ironically, allowed the US to support a lot of military dictatorships in the region without really discussing the contradiction of that. Chile, I think Nico already mentioned, is one of the most important examples, but also the Condor operation, which was much more. I think that there are a huge historiography right now that is showing how much the US was the coordinating force of this operation. So for many people, because Chavez himself presented as the socialism of the 21st century, it was kind of obvious almost, and Maduro, of course, had been attacked for non-legitimate elections. There was the expectation that democracy was going to be mentioned, at least as a justification for the US invasion of Venezuela. So a lot of people were puzzled. Why not? Why it's not on the forefront? And then here, I think we can all agree that democracy in this previous operations or in this previous interference was never the real goal. But I think it's important to think, what does it mean and why it's not there anymore? I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Trump is now talking to an American audience. He's not anymore interested in talking to the global audience. And there is a big change when you look at polls about how people perceive democracy in the US. Has changed in the past decades. The Pew Research has done surveys since at least the end of the Cold War, so starting in the late 70s. And here you can really see that although there is still, and continuously from the 70s, if you think in sort of normative terms, there is a continuous and constant support to the abstract idea of democracy. But when you actually look at questions that that ask what is the role or what the U.S. what the role the U.S. should have in promoting democracy abroad, there is growing cynicism that this should be that the U.S. should interfere or spend resources, and also about the fact that the U.S. is increasingly perceived by Americans themselves as not being effective. So ironically, this is one agenda where the two poles of the polarization in the U.S. agree. So the extreme right basically believes we should not do it because, of course, America first, and the extreme left, or the left, there's no extreme left really in the U.S., not substantially in Congress at least, but actually don't think that promotion of democracy it's something that it's doable because there's been so many criticisms, especially after the Afghanistan and everything. So basically what's happening is that I think that promoting democracy, it's not interesting anymore, and Trump knows it. So for him, why build that? On the other hand, and I'm sure Felipe is going to talk more about it, talking about oil becomes very attractive to his audience, right? He's basically what he's saying, I'm going to get a good deal for you to get cheap gas, which is one of the demands. I mean, if you think about all the environment agenda and the type of policy of growth. So I want to end. Do you want to?
I have a question, because before we talk about oil, I want to talk about religion. Okay. Because the U.S. is well known to use many strategies to infiltrate. And particularly the role of evangelical movements has been an avenue to shape the way that the United States engages, but not formally, but of course as part of a multi-pronged strategy. Can you say a little bit about that, about the role of these movements, about how they shape value discussions, and how, of course, they also play a role in politics?
In the U.S., you mean, or
no,
in Latin America?
In Latin America.
In Latin America. So that is a big debate. I mean, I think most of you probably have seen polls that shows that Latin America has been traditionally a very Catholic region. More and more, the growth of evangelicals has been. I mean, I think that the idea is that in the forecast is that in 2030, at least in Brazil, they are already going to be a larger group than Catholics, which is a big change. And of course, they are much more. Catholicism in Latin America for a long time was almost like a formality. You would baptize, you do first communion, but not really being involved in a community. While the evangelicals usually, and there is a big literature that shows that they occupy a space of a welfare state that doesn't work. So the evangelical churches, in many ways, they occupy that space, and therefore they become a strong political force. Don't have time to go in all that, but there is a great documentary for those of you who are interested. It's called Apocalypse in the Tropics, that really discusses sort of this growth and this growing political interference. And of course, I mean, there they have a lot of power. It's important to say that in the beginning they supported the Worker Party. It's the first Lula's term, and they change. I know much more about Brazil than other regions. So there is quite a lot of diversity. We should not think about evangelicals also as a homogeneous force, but they are more and more present, and they, I mean, openly talk about coming to power. And of course, there they see some connections with certain evangelical groups and certain evangelical groups in the U.S. as well.
And I think this is important as we're looking at Latin America to recall that when the United States has hemispheric dominance, it's not just about politics and economics, and there's a multi-pronged strategy with respect to these engagements. And particularly for those of us who study this, it's very, very important to see all of this as one. No? And Apocalypse in the Tropic is perhaps a very good bridge to the next topic of the economy. Because what I mentioned earlier, that in Geneva and in some other places, Central and South America are forgotten, this is surely not the case in the global economy, where you have the European Union wants to have its free trade agreement with Mercosur, you have the Chinese who want natural resources, and you want to have the Americans that want the United States of America that want dominance. You might say, going to the CMV, well, all of this is really nothing new. But what do you say?
Well, I think you took away from what I was about to say in many ways, but I wanted to start off precisely with this notion of Western dominance in a now very infamous meeting that took place in the White House a little over a month ago. A few days after removing Maduro from Venezuela, Trump gathered the major CEOs of oil companies, and as he glanced at the future location of his gold-leafed ballroom, he made a comment saying American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again, adding to point that Venezuela gave us the oil. And this is my first question. Is Trump right? Could he be indeed right? And I think it's important to place this moment in sort of the context of what I find two opposing dynamics within US foreign economic policy. And the first is precisely this Monroe Doctrine updated to the 21st century, this notion of almost a form of indirect rule that British colonizers left us in the 19th century, this almost reluctant imperialist role of not wanting regime change, but instead desiring to take the oil without the burden of having to reconstruct a nation. And the second opposing contradictory dynamic has to do precisely with this impetus towards America first, bringing manufacturing back, reshoring. And as you said, there's nothing new about all of this context. In many ways, there's almost a whiff of nostalgia for the 1950s manufacturing boom, the 1930s tariffs, and the end of the 19th century kind of imperialist rush. And all of this strikes us as somewhat familiar, particularly those in Latin America. But I wanted to sort of unfold a bit these two dynamics precisely around Venezuela on the one hand, and then the case of rare earths that have been very much present in US foreign policy. From the looks of it, the operation was successful. The deal is up and running. The US is quite literally controlling oil exports from Venezuela. From an economic perspective, it makes sense. Venezuela exports primarily heavy crude oil. The US refineries are mainly, in a great majority, prepared to refine that kind of oil, so it works well. All sorts of commodity traders, including Swiss commodity traders, have been involved in commercializing these stocks. And for all that it seems, the pressure seems to be working. Just recently, Panama revised its contractual agreements regarding the canal to benefit potentially US interests. And the Venezuela regime is seemingly in line with these interests, so much so that they just revised in National Assembly the kinds of rights attributed to foreign companies. And yet, Venezuela, although possessing some of the largest oil reserves in the world, exports roughly what Libya does, a country particularly affected by war and civil conflict. There is a problem that Trump and the CEOs that gathered with him that day in Washington realized of a problem of oversupply. The US is the main producer of oil in the world today, and they cannot control the oil supply in the market, so much so that the price at which oil is being traded today would not allow for a profitable operation in Venezuela, precisely because the costs of extracting this heavy crude oil are much higher than those with lighter oil supplies. Right next to Venezuela, you have Guyana, who has immense oil reserves of the kind of oil that's cheaper to extract, and the amount of money that it would take to lift up the oil industry in Venezuela is beyond the capacity of these companies, at least in the short term. So questions surround sort of the ultimate sort of long-term benefit of this kind of operation. But I wanted to put it in contrast with, as I said, rare earths. Trump talks about rare earths frequently. He's correct in suggesting that there's nothing rare about rare earths. But the untold or the less known history was that, in fact, the US was the main producer of these rare earth minerals for most of the 1960s up to the 1980s, roughly. They actually had a national industry to refine and process these rare earths until China flooded the market with a cheaper magnet production, to the point that the few existing manufacturing facilities in the US closed down, and they are now slowly starting to come back in operation to, in many ways, try to match up China's production in the process. But here again, there are limits to this kind of approach, a nationalistic, reshoring approach, as the case of rare earths clearly represents. There is currently only one mine in the US producing these rare earths in Mountain Pass in California. They are ramping up production, and once this one mine will be fully operational, they will produce in 1 year what China produces of magnets in 1 day. And I think this gives us a sense of the gap between intention and the reality of this global supply chain, and how difficult it will be for the US to simply go at it by themselves. It is estimated that a mine in the US, given all kinds of zoning, environmental regulations, takes about 29 years to be up and running. So as much as the US would desire to ramp up production, it's limited. There are limits to what I call the Dawn Doctrine. So I wanted just to finish on a few points precisely around this Dawn Doctrine, which I think is a more apt term to the current US foreign policy, resting in kinds of neo-royalty forms of vassalage, and also the limits to economic coercion when it comes to designing foreign policy. At the same time, it puts in a kind of a naked light the real intentions of US foreign policy in these contexts, while previous administrations were always very reluctant to make the case that this was all about oil. Trump doesn't seem to have the same issues. At the same time, as some have pointed out, this is in many ways the last salvo of US dominance and US imperialism, and it's many ways the demise, the final demise of Pax Americana as we have come to know it. Whether it will backfire or not, where we should stand, if this is a reason for rejoice, I don't think so. But rather than, and I'll conclude here, rather than trying to devise a sort of a Europe alone or Europe first approach to foreign policy, I think we need to also look at the US as being fundamentally born out of contradictions. And there are allies in the US, a recent case of different states who have sought an affiliation with the World Health Organization. And I think we need, and by we I mean also in Latin America, to look for those kinds of allies and those kinds of alliances, because the US is not a monolithic, and I think in many ways we would stand to benefit by seeking out those convergencies rather than trying to go at it alone. And
excellent. I think that's also particularly in the era of hybrid alliances to support different topics at the international level. These kind of convergences are particularly important to identify, be that between different states or also between states, cities, regional governments, big civil society organizations, and so forth. You've been very patient and patiently absorbing the discussion. We open now for questions, comments, both here in the room, but also, of course, online. Should you have a question online, please do not hesitate to use the question button. And I have the magic, not the black box, but the black screen here where your question then appears. And I see a hand right up here, in there, and I see you down here. And you there, many people. Okay, very good. At one point I have to go also online, of course. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists for the information. My name is Margaret, I'm from Peru, so very interested in the topic. My question is, like, this year will be super important because like Trump has been like left-winging. Now there is more like a wave of right-leaning politicians in South America that are like the ones that apparently are gonna win these elections, hopefully not, but we will see. I just wanna know what is your evaluation on how this change in like presidents will change like the current relations that we have as a region with the US, because as you could notice, like the relation with Trump with Argentina is super different than the relation that he has with Mexico or Colombia as well. So that would be my question, and thank you so much again.
We're going to collect a couple of questions. Where's the microphone? Why don't we go down here, please?
Thank you. I'm going to be close so I can give it back. Thank you again very, very much for this panel. It was very interesting. As a Venezuelan, former year worker, and alumni from this institute, I really appreciate this discussion. So again, thanks. I want to make some points and then 2 questions for the whole panel. I will go first with the points. I think it's very, very important also to bring not the other side, but the perspective also of Venezuela. So we speak about things like the president of Venezuela, where also undermining the discourse that we have within the country against this was a person that was not only illegitimate, but also had an open court in the international system. We have an ICC case against him. So we have to be careful with those words. Also, when we speak about Venezuelan invasion, I think it's points that I wanted, to clarify. So speaking about that, I also feel that there's a big mention of what Lucy was mentioning or reinforcing at the beginning, that the global governance has already had a lot of criticism, and a lot of countries, not only Venezuela, but also Iran, for example, was also how are we dealing with this? And here I'm going to go with what Maertens also mentioned, nostalgia is not a strategy. So my questions are, the first one on the region itself, how can we build a better system? So how can we build a better system? Speaking of the region, but also globally. So what can we do to really improve the system and not failing that much? And here I think perhaps for the first 2 speakers. And on the second part, it's true that perhaps in this case, this episode was not for sure for democracy, I completely agree on that. But it's also true that if we really want an economy that's stable, we need democracy. How can we intersect those elements for the future of Venezuela, but also for the world? Thanks.
Thank you so much. We go now to the lady up there, and there was a hand right here. But we go from the bottom up, and we come to you.
Thank you. My name is Graziella. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Graduate Institute. And congratulations for the panel. My question is especially for Graziella and for Felipe. Graziella, you mentioned democracy within the United States, for the people of the United States. What about the definition of democracy within Latin America? Do you think there's a divide between political leaders and the people, if we consider democracy is by the people and for the people? Do you think that the political leaders are afraid of this retaliation from Trump, so they prefer to manage their country in order that they are not to confront Trump? And what would be then the effect of this on regional alliances? Thank you very much.
Nico, just a few steps up on the left. On the left.
I'm Catherine Parley, an alumni of the Institute, and also retired from UN and World Bank organizations. I want to come back to the Trump, Latin America, and multilateralism. At the end of this year, Moraes is going to step down as Secretary General of the UN. I would like to know, since Latin America has its turn to present a Secretary General, how do you see this affecting the US-UN relationship? And in particular, we talk a lot about having a woman Secretary General from Latin America. How will that affect the Trump-UN relationship in your view?
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. And then I will also, in the second round, I count on 9. Of course, there was a hand up here. The gentleman here with the red jacket.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Mark Kalman, retired from the WTO. I have a question about this notion of end of multilateralism. The question is, could you not argue that what we are witnessing is not the end of multilateralism, but that we are witnessing new forms of multilateralism? And this also relates to the point that Mr. Calvo made. I don't think it's correct to say that when it comes to issues like critical minerals, that the US wants to go alone. The US is building new coalitions. Last week there was this meeting at the State Department about critical raw materials, critical minerals. There were some 50 countries that were present. And before that, last year, the US constructed this so-called Pax Silica coalition of countries. So the US is not behaving entirely unilaterally. And of course, another example would be the Board of Peace. You could argue this is a form of multilateralism. Now, it's not the kind of multilateralism that most people here in the room like, but strictly speaking, it is a form of multilateralism.
Thank you. And I'm going to add one more thing that just came in online. Is Donald Trump going to succeed in what no US president has succeeded since the 60s? Getting Cuba back under US influence? Question mark. Let's talk about Cuba. Do you want to start with that?
Sure, because it did come to mind, and I think it's somewhat the elephant in the room. And I think it's a problem to suggest that U.S. foreign policy has no logic, no rationality, no planning. I think in the midst of the chaos, there is a certain logic, a certain order, and Cuba is certainly in the radar of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and many others. And I think this speaks to your question about regional alliances. I think the situation in Cuba, they're strangling the country at this point. While Venezuela, later on Mexico, would be sort of the guarantees of regular oil supplies, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. I wonder what the European Union should be doing in regards to Cuba, for example. I don't see why the EU would abide by the current blockade to Cuba. It's a humanitarian disaster forthcoming, so I think we need to pay attention to what's going on and the kind of domino effect of what happened in Venezuela might have in other countries, be it in electoral cycles or in a situation like that of Cuba. You're absolutely right. I think part of this, and I think this is a legacy of the Biden administration, was to construct alliances given the inability to, in the short term, ensure those supplies. I don't think that's Trump's vision. He's fostering sort of ramping up domestic production of all kinds of resources, but obviously there are limits to it. But I think in the grand scheme of things, ideally that's what they would be. That's what they would try to do. But there's obviously much more to be said about that.
Graziella, you would like to take the question on governance and democracy?
Sure. Maybe I will go back to exactly the third point that I didn't have time to say. This is the fact that the U.S. is not mobilizing the discourse of the promotion of democracy necessarily bad for Latin America and more broadly. And I think not necessarily, right? I mean, we all knew, and I think we all kind of agree, that most international policies aiming to build democracy were not successful and kind of scary. As the director of the Democracy Center, I say that it's one of the most difficult things that anytime someone comes to me and say, I have a policy to promote democracy, it makes me quite scared, because I think that democracy, the definition of democracy is bottom up, right? So maybe there is an opportunity now for Latin America and for other places to really sort of have the space to appropriate and create new meanings of democracy that can bring together political and social equality in different ways. On the other hand, I think that not talking about democracy does not mean that they are not interfering in democracy, and they clearly are. I mean, we didn't even talk about social media here, but I think it's a clear way, and we know that all the upcoming elections are going to suffer a lot of interference from the social media, and we know that all the tech elites right now are very aligned with US policy. So when they are not talking about it, doesn't mean that they don't have a strong interest in that. And trying to be brief, I think that, of course, that has a very important impact on the regional alliances. Just this morning, and touching also on the topic of Cuba, you probably saw that Mexico was offering to help Cuba by sending oil, and they backtracked because there was a threat from Trump, and they basically had to say, we're not doing that anymore. So there's another example with the new agreement between Argentina and the US. What does it mean from Mercosur? How do we are going to manage sort of the special agreements with supposedly an economic zone? Is it actually in practice going to kill the Mercosur and the economic alliances? So there is a lot going on. I agree with you, we should not give up on democracy. And one of the things that my Venezuelan friends told me, and I completely empathize, is like, we don't have the right to celebrate political change. At the moment, it was because it was under invasion. Now it's because it's unclear if any political change is actually coming. So it's very unfair to everyone in different senses. But of course, we should not underplay the importance of democracy. But I think it might be a new or an opportunity to actually come up with new definitions of democracy, because democracy is not anymore a monopoly, let's say, and equated to capitalism, as it has been for a long time in Latin America.
Thank you. Lucile, you want to take some of the question on multilateralism?
Sure, thanks a lot for the great questions that have been asked. Maybe very briefly on the first question on the change of power in Latin America, and it just reminded me of what's happening right now at the World Health Organization, with Argentina deciding to quit the organization as well. And so here you really see how, regime and the power dynamic domestically also is affecting the multilateral system. And so to the question of how can we be a better system, I think there is, you can do the wait and see strategy and say, hopefully there'll be, the midterm election and then there'll be another government. Or you can also think of what is a crisis for one is an opportunity for another, and really reflect on what's the problem with the current system. Take seriously the criticisms that have been formulated by civil society, by the Global South for years, and maybe to think about in terms of fairness, of inclusivity, diversity, justice, like recognize that there is a deep problem in the system, even though we do want to protect the rules-based order. And I think this implies embracing complexity in different levels, which include, and this goes to the question about this is not the end of multilateralism, as you said. There is a lot of variety of formats that are emerging and that have been there for a long time, also public-private partnerships, different types of organizations that are still multilateral. But the question is, do we want to maintain the project? Not only the fact that you have different people around the table, but there is also a political project behind multilateralism, and that's here, I think, the Board of Peace. I agree with you that we could say that it's a form of multilateralism in the fact that there is, different people around the table. And at the same time, it shows that, like, even when they want to criticize multilateralism, they can't really create something so much different. But at the same time, calling it the Board of Peace instead of, Peace Council, for example, was a way it connects really to the transactional peace perspective, the fact that it depends on how much money you put on the table. It's really like board coming from the private sector. It's a privatization of multilateralism. And this is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid to have like a form of mini multilateralism that is only focused like the club diplomacy, but also this kind of uni-multilateralism that the US is doing at the moment. It's like unitarily deciding on what multilateralism should look like. And that's where Latin American countries have a very big role to play, and that connects to the question of the UN Secretary General and the election that is coming up. I don't think we can expect that there'll be a big change of how the US will see the UN, depending on who's going to be the Secretary General. It's a very tough, role to be Secretary General. With there's two hats: the Secretary, head of the bureaucracy, and then the General, like the executive power. If you take the Secretary hat, then you need to think that it's supposed to be a person that is almost denationalized international civil servant, someone that will not bring up their nationality or even their regional affiliation to the table. But at the same time, there is also the executive part. So then you want to have someone that has enough power, legitimacy, even charisma to be able to talk to countries. And here coming to the question of do we want to have a woman Secretary General, also for fairness, justice, inclusivity. And I think here there's a lot of discussion saying, oh, but if it's a woman, the US is already so critical of the UN. If it's a woman, it's going to be even worse. But do we want to have, this type of thinking? Do we want to have, again, Trump being the first mover and deciding on the agenda? Like, it's already destroying the UN. So I would say, let's go the opposite and then go straight to what we need, which is new and reform and so on.
In another panel yesterday evening, there was Karine Momal-Vovian speaking, the director of the Kofi Annan Foundation, on her dream for 2050 of multilateralism. And she said, in 2050, I want to look back at least 3 female Secretary Generals. So perhaps we have, perhaps earlier than 2050. But Nico, you want to reflect on anything, or do I go straight to the second round?
Happy to reflect. There's lots of really interesting things on the table. Maybe on the UN Secretary General, because we had an interesting panel on that sometime in November, when the race started to an extent about for the new UN Secretary General, trying to figure out what scenarios were out there. And much, of course, will depend on the extent to which the Trump administration is going to take this process seriously or kind of make it a center of attention. Right? Under normal circumstances, the fact that now Michelle Bachelet has been nominated, I think, by 3 countries in Latin America would probably have skewed the race kind of quite significantly in their favor. That it's Latin America, that it's kind of has its turn. She's a woman. She's very well known. She has kind of all the credentials that you would need. But of course, because she's a woman, she's been human rights. She's done these kinds of things. The current administration may simply want to derail it, and of course, unless you get a recommendation in the Security Council for a new Secretary General, you're not going to get anywhere, right? So I think kind of there, in a sense, that whole process is very much in the shadow of how the US wants to position itself vis-a-vis that organization, and whether it wants to play its power politics. I wanted to just briefly come back to the multilateralism point, because that's connected. Now, we see new forms of cooperation, I agree, but there's a question to what extent we want to call them multilateralism in this way, right? John Ruggie, kind of in the early 90s, wrote an interesting piece on multilateralism in which he contrasts a more formal and a more substantive notion of multilateralism. And the more substantive notion has to do not just with the fact that different countries get together, like they do now in these different fora and boards and stuff, but that they come with robust commitments to a certain form of treating each other as equals in an institutional setting, and doing things together rather than doing things alone. And that is very much kind of undermined by these current forms. Now, we can see, and I think kind of in Felipe's point about the last salvo of American dominance, I think, is interesting. Why we can read many of these reconfigurations as an attempt at, in a sense, putting in place a new order that is more accommodating of US power, in a sense that can maybe sort of lock in US power in a way that Trump at least feels hasn't been possible in the order before. The US has been taking advantage of, supposedly. But of course, kind of in this absolutely power politics dominated manner, and in a way that is very unlikely to generate the stability of the order, this lock-in effect that maybe kind of they would want, right? You have short-term deals in real estate maybe, kind of they work nicely, and then you have the property, but they might not work in, or they're unlikely to work in international politics. And as many commentators have said, right, sort of the long-term effects of this sort of ad hoc coalition building, right, are quite unlikely to be in favor of a stabilization of US power in the international order, quite likely actually the opposite of it. But in a sense, just to kind of sort of make us think about sort of those different forms, not simply as another form of multilateralism, it's in a sense probably kind of a much less stable form, one that may yield short-term results, but kind of less likely to lead long-term results as well.
There is a burning question already online, so for you to take note. What roles do or could the Organization of American States and other sub-regional economic integration arrangements in Latin America play in addressing the Trump administration's dynamics in the region? Question marks over the role of regional organizations, and we can go back in the room. Anyone who wants to come? Oh my God, gee. This all. We start with you because you're the only one on the right, and there's another one, and then we go left, and we take. I can take, unfortunately, only about 4, because we do have to end on time. Yes.
Thanks very much. If this is not the end of multilateralism, what's your most optimistic scenario? I guess post-2028, but if you think the midterms are going to deliver, then perhaps post-2026.
UN headquarters in Geneva.
Okay, just hold your horses. We can take another question. The gentleman up here, yeah, just there.
I want to go back to Nico's...
Just introduce yourself briefly, please. Thank you.
It is about Security Council. I think looking at the way Security Council has been jinxed, it has not been able to take any decision or get any. Will the world be better without a Security Council, or instead of continuing with the redundant false hope of somebody in the world, there are a lot of countries rely?
Thank you very much. And there were a lot of hands on this side, so we have the lady here in front behind the camera. And we have the gentleman to the left, and then you. But very briefly, because time is short.
Thank you so much. My name is Maertens. I just graduated this past September, and I have questions specifically for Professor Lucile Maertens. I was wondering if you could touch on the concept of blocking that you introduced earlier, specifically on what, if any, measures can be taken by the international community to counteract the U.S. manipulation of former multilateral institutions, specifically the Security Council.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we go this gentleman here, and then we go to the left, and then unfortunately I have to wrap it up.
Hello, my name is Maertens. I'm a first-year student. I was actually a student of Professor Van Neumann last semester. My question, I would like to go back to Trump. I would like to talk about Trump and the logic behind what he's doing with multilateralism. So there might be a logic. There is a logic, I suppose, on why he's doing that. But is it actually helpful for the US in terms of superpower? I think China is gaining a lot of economic power, and the EU is also getting a bit away from the US. So is it actually helpful for the US, or this positioning that he's doing?
Thank you. And yes, pass it on. Thank you for the last question.
Hello. Thank you all for your time. I'm a master's student from Nigeria. I want to ask a question to Professor Silva on critical minerals. So basically, I want to hear your thoughts on the role of Latin American countries in this global race for critical minerals. How can they leverage their natural resources in this new era, and what options and opportunities they have?
Excellent. So we're going to go down the other way again. We're starting with you, Lucile, and I'll ask you to already reflect on kind of your closing reflections as you conclude your response to your questions.
Thanks a lot for the questions. So maybe around the two questions around the Security Council. So would we be better without the Security Council because it's so blocked? I think the idea of the Security Council when it was created was also the idea that the smaller around the table, the more efficient. This is kind of what has been argued in terms of finding a way to justify not having everyone around the table like at the UN General Assembly. This can be, of course, criticized, but I think what we could say about the Security Council today is that it's still a place where great powers have to talk to each other on a very, daily basis. And so if we still believe that it's important that dialogue is important for global cooperation, I think this is at least one of the meaningful contribution that the Security Council, as it is, should still be, emphasized. And I also want to emphasize that middle powers and small states, as elected members of the Security Council, do have quite a powerful tool by being, sitting in this council, contrary to what we usually say that because of the P5, they have the veto power, then the other ones cannot do anything. First of all, they do need to vote. There is also different types of resolutions that need to be voted with not the same number of members that have to approve this resolution. And so this kind of work in the direction of what can we do to oppose this blockage that the US is doing to the Security Council. I think what we have been noticing in terms of what the elected members have been doing is where it's using the working methods and being innovative in the working methods to make sure that there is still things happening. And one very concrete example is the first resolution that was passed on Gaza was the resolution that was, there've been veto use before that, and it was when all the elected members did a coalition all together with a leading role by Switzerland, that was for the first time at the Security Council, that they managed to get this resolution approved. And so I think there is also a way, techniques to understand how this specific settings still makes sense in the current configuration, but also because it's accompanied by the UN General Assembly on the side. And this goes back to the question of how, and maybe also the optimistic scenario, how can we reflect on the new system? And I think inclusivity, fairness, and justice should be the core motives of how we reflect about the reform of the system.
You have a minute and a half each.
Okay, so I'll keep it short. Well, are we witnessing the end of multilateralism, or what might be an optimistic scenario? Well, I have trouble being optimistic these days, but I also have trouble seeing that we're at the end of multilateralism. Maybe we are, to an extent, at the end of multilateralism as we know it, but I don't think that many countries really have an appetite of giving up on those institutions. And I think, to an extent, we may actually see a return to those institutions just because the threat to them is so apparent. And obviously many countries will want to see reforms, will want to see greater inclusivity, as Lucile has said. But for want of a better alternative, I think many countries will see it's actually important for them to stick with institutions that have been created, that are there, knowing that if we wanted to create something in terms of global cooperation now, it will be pretty unlikely to be as effective and as strong as the institutions that we have. So I'd be somewhat skeptical about this. Maybe just on your point on the Trump logic, very short on the Trump logic. Yeah, I do not, as I said before, I don't think this is really conducive to U.S. power in the long term, and it is especially with a view to the alliance system that the U.S. has been creating, but is entirely undermining by the erosion of trust that all other participants in those alliances are witnessing, are experiencing right now. So as I said, there may be a short-term gain in some respects, but quite likely a long-term loss overall. All right, I respect the time.
Over to you, Attila.
Thank you. So very quickly on the question, is Trump's approach helpful to the US? I think not, but that's my opinion. But I think more importantly, it's true that it's important to think that we should not treat him as crazy, but not as a fully rational actor. I mean, as every actor in the world, he's somewhere in between. But I think more importantly, to think from a global perspective, I mean, what the US is doing, it's definitely not good for the world. So I think that that's what makes us all worried. On the other hand, I do think, and I want to end on this positive note, I think that there are opportunities to this approach. And maybe to really end in a positive note, I think it's important to think about the concert of Bad Bunny. I mean, for Latin Americans who watch that, there was something there. I mean, it's the first time that we see nationally, and it was in the Swiss news. It was a satire demi. So, and really an utopia that a lot of us felt it was done. I mean, that was something that when I was an undergrad student in sociology was already old school, the idea of like a boundless America, borderless America. So maybe Bolívar will be back in a new form or shape.
Just very briefly, in answer to your question, I think one of the strategies that has been most efficient or effective is actually standing up to the bully. And I think we saw that in Brazil, in Colombia. That's the language Trump understands, that's the language he respects, and it has been successful. I mean, Lula was able to face the bully and... come again? Right, that's the pragmatism of politics. I mean, there's the other sort of much more complicated discussion about adding value to processing facilities in countries that produce certain kinds of minerals. I'm thinking specifically about lithium, but that's a very long debate. I think the US is entering that race slightly late. China has an upper hand there. But I think maybe to conclude on my end, I think one of the benefits of the current moment is the extent to which it exposed our own dependency on the US in many ways, right? And I think that holds true of the UN, as we have discussed. We're currently in a bankruptcy, imminent bankruptcy of the UN system, in part because the UN depends largely on US contributions, which Trump has already said they will not pay and they will not honor. So I think indulging the bully is not the right strategy here. I think we need to be more proactive and more daring in the kinds of solutions we propose. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, this brings us to the end of this briefing. Thank you very much for the panelists. Thank you very much for all the colleagues behind the scenes who made this event possible, from comms, the technicians, and many others, of course. And thank you to you for making time this afternoon. Thank you.